This e-lecture is about translating cultural words. I'll briefly relate cultural words to idioms, which we looked at last week. We'll then look at cultural words, what they are, where they are, and finally I'll go over some examples using different strategies trying to translate cultural words. So, idioms, last week we looked at them and we found out that they are very much culturally embedded. Obviously they consist of a string of words, but the meaning of the idiom itself cannot be computed on the basis of the meaning of the individual words. You had several options. You could either find a similar idiom, either one that was similar in form and or in meaning, or you simply give up on the idiom and then you just translate the meaning of the entire idiom. Now, cultural words are really a different thing entirely when you look at them sort of from a linguistic perspective, but they are also culturally embedded, just like idioms, and often they have no equivalence in your target language. Now, cultural words. They are words that describe phenomena that are unique to the source text or source language culture. So, for instance, proper nouns, names of things that are unique to a culture. We've discussed already different types of foods, for instance, and you find a lot of these cultural words when you talk about food cultures. It can also be the names of different parts of systems only found in the source language culture. So, for instance, if you consider the political institutions, educational systems, military ranks, and so on, these are bound to be slightly different in the different countries, right? In the different cultures of the source text and the target text, and thus we have these cultural words, which can be difficult to translate. And when we talk about culture here, we actually see it as sort of quite a broad category. So we can obviously think about national cultures. So we can talk about Danish culture or English culture or American culture, right? And we can talk about the Danish educational system or the American political system and so on. But we can actually also think about culture in terms of subcultures, and these can be quite large, really. But we can also think about quite localized cultures, and so obviously they're a type of subculture which are sort of very narrow in scope, which really only include few people, right? Sort of relatively few people. So when we think about language in general, we can think about language, some parts of language as universal. And basically universal language, or universal words, I guess, they describe concepts which you find across most cultures. And here are some examples: walk, live, die, mirror, hat. Most languages in the world will have words to denote these concepts because they are universal, right? Across the globe, people walk, and across the globe they live and they die. So it makes sense, obviously, that languages are going to have words that describe these concepts. Yeah. Then we have cultural language, and basically this is then words that describe concepts that are specific to a culture or a subculture. All right, so again we have quite this broad understanding of culture here. And again, here there are some examples for you. For instance, fjord, fjord. This is something that is, I believe, from Norwegian, but we also obviously use it in Denmark, right? But this is sort of a very Scandinavian, I guess, culture-specific word. The same thing can be said for Elvenskave, which is sort of a Danish thing. We then have capoeira, which is a Brazilian word, which describes something from Brazilian culture. And obviously we may know of this word, but you could be in a situation where you have to translate something and the readers of your text don't know it, right? Maybe not all Danes will know what capoeira is. We have an example there from English, from British English, with the dessert spotted dick, or a kind of pudding, which we've talked about before. And it's the same thing. So this is something that refers to a dish which is only found in the UK, basically. So the words expressing these types of concepts are typically quite difficult to translate. And sometimes actually, instead of translating them, languages actually just tend to borrow them instead of coming up with a translation. Just like fjord is also used in English, for instance. So the English language has actually borrowed the term fjord to refer to, well, fjords actually, right? But sometimes there has, languages have not actually adopted these new words, and they have not come up with a translation for these particular unique culture-specific words. Finally, there's also personal language, which refers to an individual's idiolect, so basically the way that an individual will use words and expressions. And sometimes you find this, for instance, in literary works, in novels, all right, where an author can use different types of idiolects to sort of characterize different characters. So, where are we likely to find cultural words? Well, Newmark lists the following domains where we typically encounter them, and you can see, if you just have a look, that we, for instance, find them in the area of ecology. So, for instance, fjords, they're an example of this, right? So fjords are a unique sort of landscape feature which you find in some of the Scandinavian countries. We can also go down to material culture, and this is where you'll find food, for instance, but also items of clothing. Certain items of clothing are related to particular cultures. And again, we can go over here. We have social culture, organizations, of course, political, religious, and so on. And basically, as you can see, many of these are rooted in the specific world or surroundings that a culture and then its language exist in. So what do we do about cultural words in translation? Because they are actually quite tricky for obvious reasons, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about translation, it's not just a cross-linguistic type of communication, but it's actually an intercultural type of communication, right? Or translation. So basically what you do when you translate is that you mediate a text from one language and thus one culture into a text in a different language and thus culture. So since cultural words are culturally specific, the concept that is expressed by a cultural word in the source language often does not even exist in the target language, which is why it's difficult to translate. There is no word for it, right? Because the concept or the thing or the artifact simply doesn't exist. So this is where using strategies is a really good idea, and it can really help you. And I'm just going to discuss these ones here. We start off with modulation. We then look at different types of equivalents. And finally, I'm going to mention transfer and recognize translations. However, there may be other ways of dealing with cultural words in translation, right? These are just examples to show you how strategies can be beneficial and to show you how they each yield different options. And then it's up to you as the translator to select the best option for your reader, right? For your audience. So the first one is modulation. Now, modulation, it's one of our local translation strategies or micro level strategies. And basically it involves a change of perspective. So certain cultural words, and especially those referring to objects that we can characterize as members of a more general category, they can be translated into the name of that category in the target language. And we've talked about categories before in this course actually, and how some, for instance, and the example you're going to see are types of cake, right? So obviously cake is sort of at the basic level, and then we have different types of cake within that. So this way you change the perspective from the specific level to a more general level. Now let's look at the example to make this clear. So we can think about brunsviger, right? And we've talked about this numerous times, and obviously it's a kind of cake. So technically you could actually translate it into simply cake, right? This is a perfectly agreeable solution. So what we do then, because that's actually an example of modulation, what the strategy consists of is taking what we call the subordinate level category, all right, which is this very specific concept, that's the Born sphere basically. So you take that in the source language and then you translate it into the name of the basic level category. That's cake. Yeah, and this basic level category is a more generic category subsuming several different types of subordinate level categories. So here we have an example. We have the source language there and we have your target language here. Now we find the Born sphere down here, right? So this is the subordinate level category, right? Because it's sort of it's a specific thing, right? Specific type of cake. And obviously the basic level then is cake. So cake here it's more generic, right? And we can see that we can actually have lots of different types of cake within this one. So one way of translating Born sphere is simply to level up in a way, right? We simply go up one to say, okay, maybe I just translate cake, yeah? Instead of translating Born sphere, I'm going to go up one level. I meet K, and I'm going to translate that, and that turns into cake. And that's perfectly all right. Now, sometimes you might actually face an expression, all right, a word for which there is no basic level category in the target language. So one solution here is then that you would go up yet another level, right, to what's called the superordinate level. And this is quite an abstract category actually. So again, one of my favorite examples from English is spotted dick. So this is a kind of pudding, all right? And the problem here is if we have to translate it into Danish, we can't just level up one. So if spotted dick is a kind of pudding, just like Born sphere is a type of cake, right? We're still nowhere closer to a solution because we can't translate pudding either. That's impossible. That's another concept that is unique to probably Great Britain actually. So we might actually have to go one level up. We have to go up to the superordinate category of dessert. So here we have spotted dick and we can see that this is a kind of pudding. All right, and we have other types of puddings, Christmas puddings, sticky toffee puddings, all sorts of puddings here. And a pudding then is a kind of dessert, just like ice cream is a kind of dessert and so on. So the problem is here, if we wanted to treat this like the Born sphere, we would have to go up one, right? From the subordinate level to the basic level. But then we encounter the pudding level. And this is a level that we do not have in Danish. So again, we have to go up one more. That means we go all the way from the spotted dick down here, all the way up to the superordinate category of dessert. Now, obviously, dessert is quite a generic term. All right, we could have lots of things as dessert, which could have ice cream and tarts and souffles and all sorts of wonderful things. All right, so obviously, it's not a particularly sort of communicative translation, right? There's a lot of information that is lost here in the translation. So that's why it may not always turn out to be the best solution. Now let's look at some of the equivalence strategies. The first one we're going to look at is the descriptive equivalent. So that means the strategy where you sort of supply or you add in a description of the translated concept. So again, if we go back to the Born sphere example, we could actually translate this into a description of the ingredients or a description of the kind of cake that it is. So for instance, we could say that it's a cake made from an enriched yeast dough with a topping made from brown sugar, butter and cinnamon. So a lot of descriptive equivalence will involve componential analysis, and that's what we've just done, right? Because you pick apart the meaning components of the translated concept and then you translate those. But obviously it's only relevant to use this strategy if the ingredients, for instance, are important in the source text. If you believe that it's important for your reader of your target text to know what kind of cake it is and what it's made from in this case. A different type of equivalent strategy is the functional equivalent. So this is where you describe the function of the expression. So again, the Brunsvier in this case could be translated into a description of its function as a birthday cake. This is how it is sometimes consumed. But obviously this also only makes sense if the Brunsvier in the source text is indeed consumed as a birthday cake. If it isn't, right, because it is also possible to eat a Brunsvier outside of birthday parties, then this is obviously not the strategy to choose. Now you can actually combine strategies. So for instance, you could decide to combine the descriptive and the functional equivalents. That would give you something like a cake made from enriched yeast dough topped with butter and brown sugar, popular at children's birthday parties. This is quite long all of a sudden as well, right? So this could obviously be an issue. And again, it's really only relevant to supply all of this information if it is essential to our understanding of the target text. If it isn't, if all of this is superfluous and it's too long, basically going with modulation, for instance, just choosing cake, that's probably going to be a better solution. We could perhaps also find a cultural equivalent, because sometimes there is something which might not be completely identical but similar in the culture of the target language. So for instance, we could look at a position such as the Secretary of Defense in US politics. It's not exactly the same thing as Forsvarsminister, because the political systems of the US and Denmark, they're slightly different. So it's not the exact same thing, but it's actually quite close. So if you had to translate between these two words, this would be a way to go, and that would actually be an example of a cultural equivalent. Like I said, we do not actually have puddings in Danish culture, but they're a bit like cakes actually, so we could also use the term dampelkage, which is something that we actually have in Danish culture. So obviously it's both here a descriptive equivalent, but there is something of the cultural equivalent here as well. So cultural equivalents are quite useful, but you actually have to be quite careful because you want to make sure that they are actually equivalent, right? If you decide to use one of these cultural equivalent words. For instance, you probably should not translate statsminister into president, even though it might seem as if these are sort of fairly equivalent, right, from a cultural perspective, but actually they are not really, right? So it's something to bear in mind, I think, to use caution. We could also use transfer, and this is basically the process of directly transferring a source language expression into your target text without translating it at all. So this is often applied when you translate names of people, for instance, organizations. You could also use it if you would like to maintain an exotic effect in the target text. It's also often used in cases where the source text concept is so widely known that target text readers can easily figure it out. So you could, even if there perhaps is a Danish translation or you're able to translate the term, if it's quite a widely known concept, then you may decide that you just want to transfer it without putting it in, without translating it. So one thing about transfer is that you have to ensure that you know who your readers are of the target text, because obviously if you put a word in or a couple of words in English, for instance, in your Danish text, it is going to stand out, right? The readers, they're going to notice that all of a sudden you have one word or a string of words in English. So it can easily sort of seem a little bit off, all right? And it could maybe seem as if the translator was a bit lazy or something, but it could also give them the impression, right, that obviously this is something that they should know, and what if they don't know it, right? So you're really not doing the readers, I think, of the target text any favors by leaving or transferring any of the English into the Danish text. And obviously the same thing goes if you're translating from Danish into English, right? We cannot really put very many Danish words into English texts. I think a word such as hygge is fine, especially in British contexts. That's fairly widely known nowadays, all right? But that's a very recent development. Finally, we also have recognized translation. So this is a conventionalized or even official rendering in the target language. So this means that you can use this, and you should use it, in cases where you're, for instance, translating names of organizations or places, and where there is an official translation in the target language. So when there is a recognized translation available, you have to use it even though you don't like it. So here we have a couple of examples, and again we can definitely discuss whether we think they're any good or not, but that doesn't really matter. So one thing to bear in mind if you're translating a text and sort of a name of a place, an organization, and so on, if that is present, you should really try to see if there is already a recognized or conventionalized translation available for you, right? So that's very important that you choose the correct one.